Welcome to the Astrology of the Famed. I'm Kathy Rose in Virginia Beach, Virginia.
I'm Elisabeth Grace in New York City. And Kathy and I are both professional consulting astrologers.
And we're also writers with published work about the horoscopes of famous people.
And we are teachers who believe that there is no tool more powerful than astrology for understanding why people are the way they are and why things happen to them when they do.
Today, we're talking about Ghislaine Maxwell, a woman who's been in the spotlight for decades. She's now a convicted sex trafficker and close associate of the notorious sex offender Jeffrey Epstein,
who is now deceased. You don't have to be a professional astrologer or even a serious student of astrology to appreciate how Ghislaine Maxwell's horoscope reveals the human within.
We're going to explain it all to you in plain English, and we think you're going to find this fascinating.
Because astrology is amazing. Let's get started with part 2 of our 3-part series on the horoscope of Ghislaine Maxwell.
And we're going to begin now with Ghislaine Maxwell's father dying in November of 1991.
Mm-hmm.
So he went from business guru to crooked tycoon. He died in disgrace.
500 million missing from the pension fund.
500 million, $500 million. Yeah, so imagine if you're an employee and then all of a sudden your pension fund is gone. That's abuse.
Mm-hmm.
He used the money to bail out some of the losing companies in his empire. And they found out about this after he died. He actually died in mysterious circumstances. Why don't you explain a little bit about that?
Well, it's really interesting because we talked in episode 1 about how strong Neptune is in Ghislaine Maxwell's horoscope. And Neptune refers to deception and scandal and espionage and smoke and mirrors and ships and oceans. And Ghislaine's father, well, the official word was that, he slipped and fell off of his yacht, the Lady Ghislaine, and drowned. And maybe he had a heart attack and fell and drowned. It's not entirely clear what happened. There are allegations and entire books that have been written exploring the idea that Robert Maxwell was actually a spy and he may have been murdered by intelligence officers from another country. And maybe he didn't even die on that yacht, but maybe it just sort of was made to look that way, which is fascinating when we get into part 3 about what happened to her paramour, Jeffrey Epstein.
And how he died.
And how he died under mysterious circumstances, and no one is quite clear.
Murder or suicide. Exactly. And so there's a repeating theme here.
A repeating theme.
Isn't that amazing?
Yeah.
But the family went into chaos, obviously, when the father, the head of this mega empire, suddenly dies. And the 2 brothers, Ian and Kevin, who were busy, they were part of the company. They were accused of misuse of pension funds, and they were under investigation. They were eventually acquitted in 1996 after a 130-day trial. And we're mentioning this just to appreciate how much chaos happened in the family at that time. Let's look at the astrology for the death of Robert Maxwell. Now, this is a bi-wheel. So for those of you who aren't that savvy with astrology, the inner wheel is the natal chart. The outer wheel are the positions of the planets by solar arc. And you're going to see up at the top of the page, it says outer wheel solar arc set for November 5th, 1991, which is the date her father died. And what we look for, solar arcs, by the way, if you don't know, it's a measurement that takes every single planet in the chart and it clicks the chart forward. All the planets simultaneously hold their same position, 1 degree per year of life. And what we look for as astrologers are contact. So we look for transits and solar arcs working together. And there are some big things happening, as we would suspect, for the death of the father and the big lifestyle change. So why don't we start with a big one? And Elisabeth, why don't you start talking about her Saturn, which is unaspected. Hopefully you watched part 1 and you heard us talk about unaspected Saturn in her horoscope standing out with incredible power. And look what's happening to it when her father dies.
She had made a transition in January of 1991. She had left Europe and had moved to New York to be the representative on behalf of her father, who had purchased the New York Daily News. And so she was supposed to be in New York doing that. So she had her Saturn return, and which is a period in life where people tend to, they invest in a career. Okay. They take on more grown-up, committed positions. So that's what she had done.
The fact that her Saturn return, which happens to everybody right about 29 years old, everybody receives Saturn going all the way around the horoscope by transit, coming back to the natal position. It is a major marker in time. It is when we grow up and pick our path. It is when major choices happen. We become an adult. We become an adult. So the fact that her Saturn return was complete, the exact final hit was February of 91. Her father dies in November. Okay, so Saturn wasn't exactly on her Saturn when her father died, but it was in the zone of the Saturn return type of change that takes place. And again, since her Saturn is unaspected, anytime her Saturn receives contact, it's going to be big, it's going to be powerful, it's going to make a loud statement. So that's one thing that was going on just after the first Saturn return. We're going to tell you in part 3, every time her Saturn is hit, how big things took place. She also had the transit from Uranus and Neptune, which were in Capricorn, which were conjunct her Mercury at the time of his death. This is important because, number one, Mercury's in the 8th house, which can be a house that sometimes is activated when you receive an inheritance. Sometimes there are deaths that happen with the 8th house, not always. But in this case, it's important because Mercury rules her ascendant. And when the ruler of an angle is aspected by transit or solar arc, it's a big deal. So it's a mindset change. Uranus is something sudden. Neptune, in this case, could have been a bit of a wipeout, a bit of a confusion because it was a shock. So that was hitting her Mercury, which was her mindset, her way of thinking. And then solar arc Mercury moving by solar arc, was up here at the midheaven, just past it by 1 degree, but was conjunct her Jupiter. Now, here's what I want to say about receiving a solar arc from Mercury. And she has a pattern of this, but I find it's a pattern in life in general. When you receive an arc from Mercury, when you receive it by conjunction, square, or opposition, particularly conjunction, many times there's a major announcement or major news that comes in. Sometimes it's a lot of travel, sometimes it's big decisions, sometimes it's contracts. But in this case, it was a major announcement. Hey, Dad died. Now, it wasn't exact to the minute, but that doesn't matter. You know, it's exact by the degree, and it was very close by minute.
And we did have Saturn. The transit of Saturn to Saturn was final in February of 1991, but Saturn was exact on her midheaven and in contact with her Jupiter in January. So within 30 days of her father's passing, within 2 months, she had, she was dealing with Saturn on the midheaven.
And we're going to show that in a slide that's coming up here in just a moment.
Okay.
One other thing that I have to mention on this slide, which is the solar arc from Uranus. You'll see the bright red arrow here at the bottom of the screen. And it says solar arc Uranus, SA means solar arc, equals Aries point. Well, we talked about the Aries point in episode 1, which is when a planet or an angle in the natal chart is at 0 degree cardinal of any one of the 4 cardinal signs. Actually, it can begin at 29 mutable. It can go to 1 cardinal, but it confers high visibility. It offers prominence and visibility. It puts you in a spotlight. When planets arc to the Aries point, this is a specialty technique. Noel Till taught this. I have written an article about it. It's on my website. I'm going to lecture about it. When planets arc to the Aries point, there is also a special bloom that takes place. And so here we have Uranus, the ruler in modern astrology of the midheaven, arcing to the Aries point. And what comes forward is the fact that her career is going to take a big direction change, life changes. I just found that fascinating. And I had to mention it because I watched for this.
And it's arcing to Mars.
Yes.
So the shock to the system. Yes. Okay. So this whole, just what happened to her father, where she finds herself in life. It's as if transiting Uranus. It's as if Uranus by transit was squaring or her Mars. So we're going to see some prominent action, daring, shock, accident.
So solar arc Uranus at the Aries point, making a square to natal Mars at the Aries point. It's huge. It's a major shift in life. And it's not always negative. So if you see this coming in your own chart, you don't want to go, oh my God, who's going to die? Please don't do that. That is cookbook astrology. That's sensational astrology. It's very troubling to me. But what you can say is that there is going to be movement in life, sudden change, development that needs to move things forward and release stagnation. For Ghislaine Maxwell, it was. But see, what we have to do is synthesize all these patterns happening at one time, not just cherry pick one thing and isolate them from the rest of the measurements taking place.
Yes.
So there was a lot. This explains the astrology, the Saturn return happening just prior, Saturn moving to the midheaven, which we'll show you in a moment, transit Neptune and Uranus on her Mercury, solar arc Mercury on her Jupiter. I mean, it just goes on and on.
Of course, we would expect that. We would expect that. Yes.
All right. So here we go. Dad gone, money gone, name is tarnished, and the name was tarnished. This began a period where the name Robert Maxwell was scandalous. I mean, finding out $500 million missing from a pension fund and all those people who had worked for him having their pensions challenged. So she permanently moved to New York City at that point in order to reinvent herself. Big time change, as we just showed you on the chart. Okay, so now if we move forward just 6 months, this is the solar arc outer wheel for June of 92. I wanted to pick that date because that's when a key solar arc became exact, which was solar arc Jupiter right here at 10 degrees Pisces had arced to oppose her natal Pluto in the 5th house. So she met Jeffrey Epstein as soon as she got to New York, and they started dating, they started hanging out, they started a relationship, substituting daddy for Jeffrey Epstein, another famous, powerful man, right?
And Jupiter rules her 7th house. So you would see the potential that whatever Plutonian experience she's going to have, whatever deep, irresistible connection she's going to have, is likely to be connected to a one-on-one relationship.
And plain and simple,
significant other.
She started dating a very powerful man.
Yes, she did.
And the other thing about receiving contact from Jupiter to Pluto, whether it's by transit or solar arc, and especially conjunct, square, or opposite, it's often very fortuitous. Sometimes it's not, depending on how you're living your chart, of course, but it can often be where power is expanded.
Well, we could debate whether or not it was fortuitous for her to meet this guy, okay, perhaps
Yes.
it wasn't. Arguably,
Yes.
it was not fortuitous, although at the time
Yes.
it seemed like a really good idea.
And we have to mention the fact that transiting Jupiter was conjunct her Pluto at that same time. Right. So Pluto received the transit from Jupiter and the solar arc from Jupiter simultaneously, and that made a powerful statement. You see this in a client consultation, you go, whoa, there's an opportunity here for relationships. What are you going to do with it?
Relationships of empowerment and resourceful. Like, who are you going to ask for help? Because people are probably going to help you.
Mm-hmm. And here we see transit Saturn was exact on her midheaven in February of 92. So when the father died, transit Saturn was heading to that midheaven. It was so close. It doesn't matter if it was exact or not. It was in range. Mm-hmm. And whenever you receive a transit from an outer planet or any solar arc to an angle, these are moments of major development in life. The angles, which if you're watching my cursor, the angles would be the ascendant, the fourth house cusp, which is called the IC, the descendant, which is the seventh house cusp, or the midheaven, the 10th house cusp. Those angles are the most powerful zones in the horoscope. And when they receive contact, major life development takes place. And here we see it, right?
Yeah. And if we have been talking to her at this point in her life and looking at her at this point in her life, we would be looking ahead as consulting astrologers to see where these planets, these solar arcs are going. And we would notice, and we're going to get to the slide and talk about what actually happened, but you would see in this moment, you anticipate that, oh, look at that Venus at 26 Capricorn. It's going to connect with that Saturn. You can see it's by a factor of 2. And oh, look at that Sun at 4 degrees Aquarius. It's going to be at the top of her chart in 4 years. And so you might have a chat with your client and anticipate, what might happen, and the story will continue. You'll see. But you see this ahead and you prepare.
Absolutely. So we're talking about the time when Ghislaine is building a new life with Jeffrey Epstein. And in the 1990s, I grabbed a quote from that docuseries I watched on Paramount Plus. We'll show you the graphics for that again, but we did show it in part 1. And there was a woman named Lady Victoria Hervey who was a friend. She was one of Prince Andrew's ex-girlfriends. She was a model. And she said, in the 1990s, Ghislaine and Jeffrey were considered hosts with the most. They played with powerful people. They circulated. They were a big deal. They made it their mission to collect people of power. And Ghislaine was organizing and managing Epstein's life at that time. Everything about it. I want to say something here. The other thing I learned, which I didn't really realize, is they said Epstein was socially passive. Mm-hmm. And Ghislaine came in and really helped him with all that cardinal energy she has, all that Capricorn, and made things happen. It's interesting, isn't it?
Yeah, I think his Venus-Mars conjunction is in Pisces. It's sort of, kind of, in the quiet type.
And she was his entree into society. Mm-hmm. So she was a stepping stone for him. So the two of them were very efficient together.
Yeah, they were a great team.
Yeah, they were a great team.
They really were.
Used for good. Think of what they could have done.
Think of what they could have done, because they worked very well together. Sure.
So here again, let's go back to the chart, and we're going to look at the solar arcs in place for January 1st of 1994. And we're entering this power period where Ghislaine started to recruit and groom young girls. Now,
that we have seen this coming.
We have seen this coming. And what happened was, in the early part of their relationship, they were seen everywhere. They were inseparable, and they were a couple, supposedly, and together. But Jeffrey Epstein had very, very, very strong sexual needs and urges, obviously. And starting in about 94, she wasn't enough for him. And they actually lived in two separate apartments starting at about that time. And that's when this recruiting and grooming young girls, if you remember from part 1 of this series, we talked about how Ghislaine has this Southwest Hemisphere emphasis, which is what Jeffrey wanted, Jeffrey got. She sensed what he needed with that Western Hemisphere emphasis. Okay, I'll make it happen. I'll make it happen.
This need to please, this need to think about what does this other person need? And, we would be counseling somebody like this and saying, what do you need to do for yourself? Why don't you go get a graduate degree? Why don't you go get an assistant or something, and go do something on your own? Why are you giving yourself away to this other person?
Exactly. So let's look at the astrology of launching into this active recruiting and grooming period. And the first thing is just what Elisabeth had mentioned in the slide prior. Solar arc Venus has now moved to make the conjunction with unaspected Saturn. Again, unaspected Saturn being the biggest player in her entire horoscope, the planet with the most power because it receives no aspects. Venus coming in. And what does Venus symbolize?
Social expression and women and unconditional love. But Venus is in Capricorn, where it can be somewhat emotionally immature because Venus in Capricorn sometimes thinks about strategy and using people and things for the sake of status and accomplishment. So you have to be a little mindful with that placement.
Well, and the other thing, when you receive an arc from Venus, when you receive Venus contact, Venus is charm and grace and beauty. And she was very charming with these girls she was grooming. She convinced them we're going to talk about the psychology of grooming, but please remember, this started with solar arc Venus equaling her Saturn, and she knew how to work people in order to get them to do what she wanted.
Yes.
She also had solar arc Uranus squaring the sun at that time. And so here you see solar arc Uranus in the 5th house, squaring her natal sun in the 8th house. And that's just circulating energy. That's, in a way, that's saying, hey, maybe she needed a new adventure, needed excitement, needed something new. And as negative and horrible as it is to be recruiting young girls for sex trafficking, I mean, it's despicable, but maybe she saw it as a conquest. I mean, she has Sun Mars conjunct.
Well, we also see it, and we mentioned this in part 1, that the unaspected Saturn, when we were talking about midpoint pictures, that Saturn doesn't talk to any one planet in her horoscope, but it does connect with the midpoint, the halfway point of Mars and Uranus. And that is a midpoint that can reflect a need for excitement, ingenuity. There's a high-tech component to it sometimes. So when this solar arc Venus connected with her Saturn, it was also connecting with the Mars Uranus midpoint. And that midpoint, Venus equals Mars Uranus, often reflects a period of high excitability, specifically sexuality, passion. This is a book. You can read it right here. Here's our source, Noelle Till, who has spent a lot of time analyzing these midpoints, and also that is what how we learn to appreciate the potential of this life development.
So this is the beginning of the 10 years of actively recruiting. Okay, 1994 to 2004. They were inseparable in public during that time, living in two separate apartments instead of living together. And Jeffrey wanted girls, some as young as 14. This is the image from the docuseries I watched on Paramount Plus. And one of the things that the victims said, they interviewed a lot of the victims, and it's kind of heartbreaking to listen to their stories. But one of them said, Ghislaine had grooming down to a science. It reflects her chart with all that Capricorn energy. She had it down to a science. One of the things that high Capricorn people can do is strategize, systemize, organize. They're great at that. And she had that kind of mind with Mercury in Capricorn, Sun Mars conjunct in Capricorn.
At some point in our talk about grooming, maybe we talk about the fact that she only has one planet in water and lacks that empathy.
Let's do that in this part.
Okay.
So let's talk about the 5 stages of grooming, taken from a psychological perspective. I don't think Ghislaine had any training in this. I think it was instinctive and natural, and she just did what she was talented to do. But the 5 stages of grooming, you select a vulnerable victim. You gain access to and isolate the victim. And here's where we have to remind people of all the different locations and the fact that Epstein had the private plane, and they would whisk them off to the island or to all the locations they have. We're going to cover that in a moment. You develop trust with the victim. And then you desensitize the victim to physical and sexual contact. Now, again and again and again, if you watch some of these documentaries on her or you listen to interviews, people talk about the fact that Ghislaine would teach them how to massage Jeffrey Epstein and then introduce, hey, remove your clothing. And it would all just be so normal. They wouldn't make a big deal about it. They'd started to desensitize them to what really is not appropriate. They were very good at that. They would develop trust with the victim because Ghislaine was not a threatening figure. She was more like a big sister. And she would approach these young girls and, start to charm them as a woman. An older man may not have been able to achieve that same thing. And then using maintenance strategies to facilitate future abuse and prevent the victim from telling anyone. A lot of cases, it was bribery. They would give them money. They would money. We'll pay for your education later. Some of these victims that they chose were in really hard circumstances.
Yes. So it makes it feel like, one of the things in Ghislaine's horoscope that is lacking in the elemental balance, they're fire, air, earth, water. She's got a lot of earth, some fire. She only has one planet in water. And so water, when you have planets in water, that is empathy, sensitivity, feeling. If you don't have a lot of water in your horoscope, it may be challenging for you to process and connect with how other people feel. So we've been talking about this strategy that Maxwell and Epstein had with their victims, particularly for Ghislaine, because she's the one who's going out, crusading. If from on our last, in our first video, we talked about how in a vocational profile, being on a crusade or championing a cause and promoting, well, this is what she's decided to, this is her crusade, get girls for Jeffrey. This is her deal with no empathy.
She knew how to sell.
She knew how to sell, but without being able to fully connect with the depth of feeling that these young girls might have. And the way she would, make them give them a sense of worth was transactional, give them money but there's no real care.
Yes. And most of these victims were one step away from homelessness. So what we're talking about is Ghislaine, who had been raised in a family of privilege, 53-room mansion, had rubbed elbows with VIPs, And it's a different orientation than these young women who were one step away from homeless. Some of them were drug addicts, some of them in very bad circumstances. And without that empathy from the water signs, you could see how, hey, it's okay to abuse these people, potentially. And the groomers move from victim to victim. And power is the means to keep the victim silent. It's very sad. And this is the dark part. And this is painful. It's just painful. Girls 14 to 17 years old. Okay, so they created this empire, unfortunately. So here's a few more quotes. One of the victims said, "This is what Ghislaine would do. You give me this, I'll give you that." Transactional, as Elisabeth said.
Business. It's just business. Capricorn.
I pay for this, you give Jeffrey that. And one of them said Ghislaine had a nose for that. They commented over and over and over in this docuseries how Ghislaine just would glide in and instinctively know what to say, when to say, how to make somebody feel comfortable, how to charm them, so that these girls, kind of led by the Pied Piper, going in and doing what they wanted them to do. Look at this. This is the power period that took place between 94 and 2004. Of course, the astrology really starts kicking in hardcore in 95, but it really started in 94. And often right before an aspect is exact, you start to feel it. So we're talking a 10-year period. Now, Elisabeth, describe to somebody, if you had a client and you saw these patterns coming, let's describe what we do as professional astrologers when we have clients and we see these kinds of patterns coming.
We would point out the very strong potential for recognition and success and reward, especially with the home and family and reputation, coming to fruition in 1996. I'm looking right at the top of the chart here. The first thing that I'm not going chronological, I'm looking at that. That's the first thing I'm seeing is those solar arcs from the sun, the ego identity, to the midheaven. These very rare, once or twice in a lifetime periods where usually you have found your place in the sun. You are being rewarded for who you are. And so if we were talking to, so it's 1994, we'd be having a conversation of, where do you want to be in 2 years? Because the chances are you're going to get it. You can make plans now. This is what we would be saying. How are you going to maximize this opportunity?
Now, I often will look 10 years in advance for these solar arc patterns and transits overlapping, because they're like stepping stones across the river. You get from one place to another. And I want to see the marker times coming up for my client, and I want to prepare them for it and say, hey, put this in your back pocket. It's like, a savings account. You have this energy that is going to open up for you at this time. Let's figure out how you can use this on the highest level for your life purpose.
But you also can use the awareness of what's around the corner to help clients manage a current phase of uncertainty. Like I heard from a client yesterday that I spoke with in July, and she was at a point in her life where she's like, this is a very driven person, ambitious person, wants to get places in life. And she was very anxious about what was going on in the last 6 months of 2021. And yet I'm seeing similar patterns that we're seeing in Ghislaine's horoscope coming to fruition in, like now. And I'm telling her, don't be anxious about it. There's no need for anxiety. These things will come together, and they have. I just heard from her. She said, what you told me, how you said the flow of events was likely to occur. That is exactly what happened. Nothing happened in the last half of 2021, but the things that we talked about, I was prepared for them. The opportunity came. I took it. I'm happy.
Yeah, these patterns are like having the wind at your back. And you look at them and you want to prepare the client to be able to utilize them. So let's go through some of these, because you're going to learn a lot right now. All right. So we'll go a little bit chronologically. First of all, when you see a natal chart where the you have a grouping of planets like this. In this case, for Ghislaine, it's in the 7th and 8th house. When we think of solar arcs, we know people with planets in this zone are going to have all those planets 1 degree per year of life clicking forward, heading up to this midheaven, which is the peak period in the horoscope, a period of prominence potentially. And not all people get that, but when you receive some of these arcs, they are fabulous. But let's go over here on the left side of the screen. You're going to see in 1995 and 6, she had transit Uranus and Neptune conjunct Saturn, this Saturn pattern, this Saturn, which is the strongest planet in her chart. So transit Neptune and Uranus, activating all this potential with her unaspected Saturn, was part of the process.
That's a challenging pattern.
That
can be a challenging pattern because Uranus is like the lightning bolt that shakes up your structures, and Neptune can dissolve whatever it touches and can leave you feeling somewhat bewildered because your structures, the structures you rely on are getting a little blurry.
What was happening for Ghislaine at that time is that she was not Jeffrey Epstein's number one sexual partner anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And I've read over and over, during that time, she was obsessed with her own body, trying to make sure she was thin enough, trying to make sure she was beautiful enough. And instead of being hurt and crushed by the fact that all of a sudden Jeffrey just didn't want her, he wanted all kinds of other girls, she just went into action and utilized that Capricorn energy and said, all right, let me make a business of it. So I could see where that could be a stressful period, but she activated the business end. But here's what we have to say. It was happening simultaneously with one of the most auspicious arcs you will ever receive if you live your life well, which is solar arc sun moving up to contact the midheaven. And then in this case, because she has Jupiter on the midheaven, solar arc sun equals the midheaven. So you see, these were happening in 96. Remember, this outer wheel was set for 95. So if you add 1 degree, because 1 year later, the sun would arc and hit the sun and hit the sun would arc to hit the midheaven and then Jupiter. Oh, you see that coming in advance. You want to tell the client, get ready, do good work. You will be rewarded.
Get ready, but pay attention to what's happening with that Saturn, because out of that, because there's a kind of a squishy foundation, meltdown that may be happening here. Things are being blown up in ways that maybe seem exciting and shocking, but also somewhat. I mean, you'd have to talk to them and say, now, what exactly are you doing? Is it
for Ghislaine?
Yes. For Ghislaine, like, what are you? Oh, you're going to the school. What are you doing?
Being the person who ran Jeffrey's life, she organized all of his travel because he had a private plane. She organized the household. She hired all the staff. She created, I think it was an 85-page manual for the household. Now, I'm not sure I'm exact.
50, that's like 58
yes,
page.
Very thick, many pages, trying to tell the staff exactly what they can do and all filled with rules, which is Saturn. Then we have in 1998, because see, as astrologers, we don't just take one aspect out of context with the rest, and we don't take 1 year out of context with the rest. There are developmental periods in life where you will have a span of years with multiple aspects popping, pop, hitting that chart. You need to look at the whole wave of development, not just 1 year, not just one aspect. So one thing flows into the next, right? It's like a wave of development. Transit Uranus. After it's done working on the Saturn, transit Uranus, which was moving faster than Neptune, moved forward to hit the midheaven in 1998. And, that can be disruptive. That can be a lot of change happening, but it just accelerated what she had started in 94 and 5 with this recruitment.
Yep.
And solar arc Mars equaled the midheaven in 1999. So you see it here 4 degrees away from that midheaven by solar arc. You add 4 to the Mars at 4 degrees Aquarius, and you will get 8 Aquarius. It just continues to add to what started when the sun hit the midheaven and hit Jupiter, and it just kept rolling out, right? Like putting out the red carpet.
It was all of this success, but it's just interesting that the Uranus Neptune conjunction on her Saturn too. It's like the foundation was a little squishy, but it's like when you're in trying to understand how could these choices have been made, what were you can see how she went off in that unsavory direction.
And then you have another major aspect, which is transiting Pluto coming to conjunct the descendant. And I'm just looking, I didn't realize I put a typo here. It says 1999 through 200, which should be 2000. So I apologize for that. My bad.
I didn't even notice it.
I remember.
I would not even have seen it if you hadn't pointed it out. But some Virgo watching this is going to put it in the YouTube notes. Right. They're going to say, that was the most amazing presentation I ever saw. But why didn't you do? It's going to be there. I'm telling you.
But I remember being so excited, finding these patterns and hearing the developmental stages that I guess I just dropped that 0. But it's so important to understand transiting Pluto coming to the descendant. Now, if you take that just all by itself, so it's a 2-year cycle, all through 1999, all through year 2000. In some cases, if you're in a really bad relationship that needs to end, Pluto coming to the descendant can end it. It can be a major relocation. It can be major empowerment personally. Pluto strives to bring empowerment when it makes contact. But they had something going on, and it was working like clockwork, unfortunately, and it just kept accelerating and growing. But you know what was happening during this time? Pluto conjunct the descendant. All kinds of famous men were involved with abusing these young ladies.
Right.
All kinds of famous men.
Pluto transits to the angles or solar arcs from Pluto to the angles. It tends to make the powers that be identify with you. They come calling. They see you as one of them. I've seen, so in client work with people who are not doing sex trafficking for a living, it can suggest a period where, you get a phone call from the VP of such and such, and they want to recruit you to come into a position of power.
And that was normal life for them.
Right.
That was just normal. So, presidents and politicians, there's going to be a slide coming up where we talk about this. Princes, Prince Andrew, they were rubbing elbows with all the important people. And it didn't start only in 99. That was going through the entire period, the entire 10-year period. All these famous people were coming in and using these young girls sexually. Just a terrible thing. But then it's followed up since Uranus and Neptune made the conjunction in 95 and 6 to Saturn. Then Uranus started going faster, moving faster than Neptune. So Uranus hit the midheaven first, followed up a few years later by Neptune hitting the midheaven by transit in 2001. And at the same time, transiting Saturn, hitting the ascendant in 2001 and 2002. Now, something important happened here when Pluto made conjunction to the descendant in 2000, and that is they recruited somebody named Virginia Roberts, who became central in stirring things up. She has done lawsuits against a lot of these major players, including Prince Andrew. Just had a huge settlement. We'll talk a lot about that in part 3, but year 2000 was when she came in. She was part of the picture from 2000 to 2002, and she was a big deal.
Yes. Yeah, that's brilliant. That's such a perfect thing. The seeds were planted.
If she had used this horoscope well, she could have done so much in the world. She could have accomplished so much good, but she didn't. Her choice. That's where free will comes in. And again, if you looked at this horoscope when she was a baby, not knowing anything about her, would you have said, wow, you're going to be infamous. You're going to wind up in jail. The sexual energy is going crazy. Maybe you're going to break the law. No, you wouldn't know that. You wouldn't know that.
You wouldn't, but we can see how, the reigning need of this horoscope is the need for love in ways that are grand and escapist and fantastic and glittery and perhaps spiritual, and where the self might be lost because of this. We're going back to these basic core patterns. This T-square that we talked about in episode 1, part 1 of this series, with Neptune squaring the moon in Leo, squaring Jupiter. Angular planets. They're very, very prominent. This woman needs to be grand. And then again, this orientation, she's giving herself away. This is a people pleaser. Behind all of that manipulation and stuff, this is a woman who still is going in and placing the needs of this one person. We have never spoken to her. She might tell us that this is completely wrong because we're not hearing it from her, but this is what we're observing, that she placed fulfilling this one person's need above taking care of doing something productive for herself.
Yeah, there we go. And then the icing on the cake is she received solar arc Venus on her midheaven in 2004. So again, what we are appreciating and what we teach our astrology students is when you see a chart with a grouping of planets like this, then you have to project forward. They're all going to arc together, and within a certain time frame, hit that midheaven, pop, 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 and hit Jupiter. And it's very auspicious. Venus equals the midheaven by solar arc. You see on the chart here, it's at 29 Capricorn in 1995. By 2004, it had arced to connect with that midheaven. Well, that's usually when blessings come in, rewards, gifts. And that was kind of the ending period, because right after that, Jeffrey gets in trouble. And that's what we talk about in part 3.
Yeah, exactly. It was a gift in a way. It was a gift. Yeah. Sometimes endings are gifts.
Yeah. They often refer to what happened as a pyramid scheme. And I know technically maybe that's not what a real pyramid scheme is, but that's how it was referred to in the news quite often, because girls were asked to recruit more girls, which made it a much more efficient system, where girls are said, hey, go find a few more girls and bring them to us.
She's deploying resources with high efficiency, true to her Capricorn abilities.
And this bit about in grooming, that there's a phase where you isolate them. Well, they had many, many locations. And one of them was the island in part of the Virgin Islands called Little St. James. It was Jeffrey Epstein's personal island that he owned. The locals called it Orgy Island. They knew exactly what was happening there. And once you were on Little St. James Island, which was always populated by young girls, often topless on the beach, you couldn't leave. You were stuck. And boy, you listen to that docuseries that's on Paramount Plus, and you hear the girls saying, I thought I was just going for a party. And then I found out I couldn't leave. And then someone cornered me and raped me. It's just chilling. Just chills go up your spine. It's very sad. But there were other locations too. The Manhattan Townhouse, the great big, huge Manhattan Townhouse. There was a mansion in Palm Beach, Florida. And there was a New Mexico ranch. The Palm Beach, Florida mansion, I was very delighted I just read this yesterday as I was researching, was just recently demolished.
Demolished it, which is good.
Oh, all that energy needed to be gone. Developer bought it. And what a brilliant idea. Demolish it, bless it, cleanse it, throw some holy water on it, smudge it, do it again, fill it with crystals before you build. Get all of that nasty energy out of there. Yeah. The other thing, we haven't talked about this, of course, we're going to talk about it in part 3, is that there are many accounts of the fact that Epstein wired the Manhattan townhouse and the Palm Beach, Florida mansion, and I think also the house on St. James with video surveillance, so that he would have something to be able to blackmail.
Yeah, this is when you look at her horoscope. Okay, I mean, you can look at her as a clinical psychologist without looking at a horoscope, and you can say, oh, look, this woman seems to attract a man who is not like her father, but it's in the horoscope. Okay, we don't have to read anything about Ghislaine Maxwell. We can just look at this piece of paper and start wondering how.
Well, that's the Neptune component. That's, the covert activity. Neptune is part of that T square. And what are they doing? Secretly taping. Secretly
taping, deception, fantasy. I mean, video is a Neptune thing. It's an intangible. It's an illusion. Blackmail, spying, all of this stuff. But the fact that she would then go on, because perhaps still trying to work out this relationship with the father, she goes and create and attracts a man who is so similar. It's just fascinating. Yeah. And it's in the horoscope.
Yes.
This potential,
we're going to talk. And we're going to talk more about this in part 3, especially with what happened when they raided Epstein's place in 2005. And the FBI, or the officials, have all this evidence. And guess what? It's sealed. I don't want to go there yet because I will get on a tangent.
We'll go on a big long tangent about what happened there. Yes. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So the victims mention they received visits, princes, presidents, politicians, professors. This is so disgusting. And they have the flight logs.
And corporate honchos. There have been many. I mean, people have resigned. Leon Black is somebody who's the chair of the Metropolitan Museum of Art and has, I believe it's a hedge fund. I mean, he's out, and the guy who owned Victoria's Secret, he's got some issue. I mean, there are many people. I mean, there's who are not just the princes, presidents, politicians, and professors, but the people who are corporations and banks and the money people.
Well, they have the flight logs for who went to Orgy Island.
Right.
Some of them have been entangled in these accusations, but that's part 3. That's
part 3. You have to come back and watch again.
Virginia Roberts, who is now married, and so it's Virginia Giuffre. I hope I'm saying her name correctly. I listened to how they pronounced it on this docuseries. That's how they said it. But she said, we weren't humans to them, just toys to be passed around. And that breaks my heart because, again, it's this caste system. We're rich and powerful and distorted and perverted. And you're nothing to us. You're a little speck on the ground. You will do what we tell you to do. And the lacking of empathy and so forth.
Empathy. We're just using things, but using them so well. Yes, wonderful. They're so efficient.
There's a lot to this.
Yeah.
So that's it for part 2. Part 3 is this phase of life where the law gets involved, Jeffrey gets into trouble, and Ghislaine gets into trouble. And we're going to bring it all the way up into the present moment where she's just been convicted. We're going to show you the amazing astrology that flows with it.
Amazing astrology of when karma and the law catch up to her, and the astrology catches up with her.
Yes. And here's again where we hope that we are revealing the human within the horoscope so that you remember that somebody could have had this exact same chart, could have been born the same day, the same time, maybe even in the same hospital or same city, but could have lived their chart totally differently than this.
Yeah, they would have a different experience. The timing of events would be similar, but certainly they would make different choices.
All right. So bye for now. We'll see you in part 3.
in part 3, to be continued.